The mansion was too quiet. Even grief had grown tired of echoing through its empty halls. Lilian Anarmod stood alone in the study, barefoot on the cold marble floor, her long nightgown trailing behind her. In one trembling hand, she held a framed photo of the company her father built. Anarmod Global, still shining in gold foil lettering across the building in the image. Or at least, it used to. The flames licked the edges of the photo as she held it near the fire. Her hands were steady, but her heart screamed. She watched the flames consume the picture slowly, quietly, like a secret she wasn't ready to share. "I'll bring everything back," she whispered. The fire swallowed the last corner of the photograph, turning legacy into ash. There was a time when life shimmered. Sunlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their estate, warm and golden. Laughter drifted across the room like music, and at its center stood Lilian, twirling in a silk dress while her father adjusted the clasp of her necklace. "Fashion is a battlefield, my Lily," Lawrence Anarmod had said with a smile. "But you'll be a general." She grinned. "Then I need a sword." He tapped her gently on the forehead. "Here it is. Strategy first, style second. Kindness, always." They hugged. He smelled of cedar wood and cologne, of security and hope. In her arms, the world felt right. That image, warm and whole, froze in her memory like a photograph and began to burn. Lilian didn't cry. She couldn't. Her emotions were strangled somewhere deep inside, stuck between disbelief and devastation. She stood motionless. The man who raised her, her mentor, her protector, gone. Her stepmother, Cheryl, stood beside her, dry-eyed, chin high, not a single smudge in her perfectly lined makeup. Her voice was quiet, but sharp as a blade. "He left behind more debt than legacy. I hope you're ready to grow up." Lilian turned toward her slowly, confused. "What? Debt?" she asked. "That can't be right. He said we were expanding. He had investors." Cheryl didn't even glance at her. "That expansion was borrowed," she replied coolly. "Now it's due. The company is sinking." The rain fell harder, but the chill Lilian felt came from something deeper. The lies had begun. Days later, Lilian stood at the gates of Anarmod Global. Her ID card flashed red, access denied. She tried again, still red. "I'm his daughter," she told the guards. "This is my company." The guards shifted awkwardly. "We're sorry, Miss Anarmod," one of them said. "We were told you no longer have authority." "No longer have," she repeated, stunned. "Who told you that?" They said nothing. They didn't have to. She had been locked out, her name scraped from the glass, her legacy vanished. She wasn't just cast out. She was erased. The office was dimly lit. Cheryl sat at her sleek black desk, her legs crossed, a glass of wine in one hand. A thick envelope sat on the table between them. Lilian's heart sank as she sat down. Her voice barely made it past her throat. "What is this?" "A contract," Cheryl said. "Liáng Yŭxuān, CEO of Gentech. Your father owed him more than we can ever repay. He's agreed to settle the debt in exchange for you." Lilian blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "You sold me?" "I protected you," Cheryl said, placing her wine glass down with a click. "You think I enjoyed this? You'd be out on the streets if I hadn't stepped in?" Lilian felt her stomach twist. "There has to be another way," she said, her voice cracking. Please don't do this to me." Cheryl folded her hands. "Then come up with $300 million by Friday. Otherwise, sign the papers." The rain came again that night. It tapped against the windows like a cruel lullaby. Lilian collapsed onto her bed, her fists clenched in her sheets. She screamed into her pillow until her throat burned, until the sobs became hiccups, until there was nothing left inside her but hollow silence. She cried until she was empty. She prayed for a miracle. And then she signed. Her trembling hand pressed the pen to paper, and ink bled into her name. She packed without speaking. A single suitcase, her passport, a worn photo of her father, folded neatly between two blouses, her entire life reduced to 20 kilograms and a contract. From the doorway, Cheryl watched with an expression Lilian couldn't read. "Don't embarrass us," she said. "First impressions matter." Lilian zipped the suitcase shut and stood. Her face was blank. Her voice steady. "I'll come back for what's mine," she said quietly. The plane touched down in China just after midnight. The air was heavy with mist, the skyline glowing in the distance like a dream or a warning. Lilian stepped off the private jet, heels clicking against the tarmac. She wrapped her coat tighter around her shoulders, the night wind cutting through her bones. A sleek black car rolled to a stop in front of her. The door opened, and out stepped a man, Liáng Yŭxuān, feared, unsmiling, untouchable. He was taller than she expected, sharp-suited and stone-faced, the kind of presence that made others look twice and wish they hadn't. His gaze met hers, cold, calculating, and then he spoke. "Welcome to China, Miss Anarmod," he said. Lilian stood still, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. She was frightened, proud, uncertain. But she didn't look away. The city lights flickered behind them. Somewhere in the distance, the wind picked up. This was not a beginning born of love, but it would become a story the world would never forget. They called it a home, but to Lilian, it looked like a fortress, cold, distant, and built not to welcome someone in, but to keep someone locked away. A towering estate of glass and steel sat against the night sky like a palace for ghosts. Every corner was pristine, untouched by life. The marble floors gleamed under her feet. Crystal chandeliers glistened above curved staircases, but nowhere did she feel warmth. She stepped out of the car and into silence. Not the comforting kind, the hollow kind. The maid opened the door to her bedroom with a small, respectful bow. The room was lavish, larger than her apartment back home. A canopy bed dressed in soft ivory sheets, a velvet chaise lounge near the window, a vanity lined with gold-trimmed brushes. It was beautiful, breathtaking even, too breathtaking. Lilian said nothing as she stepped inside. She didn't explore. She didn't touch anything. She simply sat on the floor in the far corner, knees pulled to her chest, and stared at the photo of her father she kept folded in her coat pocket. The one image that made her feel like she still belonged somewhere. She curled into the silence and cried. The dining hall was too long, too grand, and too quiet. A table stretched endlessly across the marble floor, glinting under chandeliers. At one end sat Liáng Yŭxuān, unreadable as ever in a black suit, hands clasped before him. At the other, Lilian sat with an untouched meal in front of her. He didn't speak, neither did she. Just forks, just knives, just distance. Days passed. She rarely left her room. The staff brought her food she barely touched. She cried in the shower, letting the water mask her sobs. She stared out the windows like they might open a door to her old life. And yet, Yŭxuān never interfered. But he didn't ignore her either. One evening, the housekeeper whispered in Mandarin as Yŭxuān entered the kitchen. "He's home early again?" "It's been every night since she arrived." He heard them. He didn't react. He set down his briefcase, loosening his tie, and asked in a voice so low it nearly disappeared, "Has she eaten today?" The maid shook her head. "No appetite." He didn't speak again. But later that night, A teacup appeared outside her bedroom door. Steam still rose from the porcelain. Tucked beneath it was a small note. "There's no rush, but you're safe here." There was no signature, but she knew who it was from. She sat on the floor beside the cup, wrapped in a thick blanket. Her eyes were puffy from crying. Still, the note trembled in her hands as she read it over and over again. She didn't cry from fear that night. She cried because she didn't understand how someone so feared could be so gentle. The next night, she surprised even herself by stepping into the dining hall before dinner had ended. Yŭxuān was already seated. He looked up briefly, his expression unreadable. She sat down across from him. When she reached for the soup spoon, his voice broke the silence for the first time. "You don't need to force yourself." She hesitated. "I'm not forcing myself," she said softly. A beat passed. Then he nodded once and returned to his food. It was the first silence between them that didn't feel cold. It felt human. The next morning, everything shattered. The press had found them. Tabloids, news sites, social media, comment sections buzzing like flies. A black heiress traded for tech debt. Gentech CEO marries exotic contract bride. She can't even speak Mandarin. What is she doing here? The headlines were relentless. Racist, cruel, vicious. Lilian sat frozen as the news scrolled across her phone. Her breath caught in her chest. In his office, Yŭxuān stood before a wall of screens. News clips, commentary, investors chattering about the bad optics, a global scandal. His assistant lingered in the doorway. "She hasn't responded to anything," he said. "Should we release a corporate denial or stage a—" "No," Yŭxuān said sharply. His jaw clenched. "Let her speak." The press conference was chaos. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted. Every polite question was laced with mockery. Lilian walked to the podium in a black suit, her heels sharp against the floor. Her posture was tall, her eyes calm. Her hands barely trembled. She took a deep breath and leaned into the microphone. "My name is Lilian Anarmod," she said, "daughter of Lawrence K. Anarmod. I'm not here for pity or profit. I'm here because I was pushed out of my own life, and I chose to survive." A hush rippled through the crowd. "I will not be reduced to a hashtag or headline. I will not apologize for being black, educated, and unafraid." Someone scoffed, a cruel laugh. She turned, locking eyes with the voice. "And if you think being different makes me less deserving, then you've clearly never known real power." The cameras clicked furiously. Behind her, Yŭxuān stood quietly. He hadn't spoken a word. Then, so gently it was almost unnoticed, he reached forward and took her hand. Gasps filled the room. She turned, surprised. He didn't look away. And for the first time, she didn't either. That night, Yŭxuān stood on the balcony outside his study, the skyline glowing before him. The wind brushed against his shirt. His phone buzzed in his pocket. His assistant's voice crackled faintly through the speaker. "Should we set a tighter schedule tomorrow? Stakeholders want answers." He didn't respond immediately, just stared into the night like it might offer something back. Finally, he spoke. "Don't worry," he said quietly. "No one will ever use her again." Behind him, just inside the door, Lilian stood in silence. He hadn't noticed her. She said nothing, but her hands, once so constantly shaking, had stilled. There was something strange about silence when it wasn't heavy. For weeks, silence had felt like a weight on Lilian's chest, suffocating her beneath layers of grief, betrayal, and fear. But that morning, standing in the courtyard garden with sunlight spilling across the stones and a soft breeze brushing her cheeks, it felt different. It felt like air. She tilted her face toward the sky and closed her eyes. The wind whispered through the leaves like a language she didn't yet speak, but somehow understood. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, it didn't hurt. She was in China, not as a prisoner, not as a pawn, but as herself. In the small Mandarin class tucked away behind a bookstore, Lilian sat surrounded by strangers who didn't look at her with judgment or expectation, just curiosity. She scribbled notes quickly, repeating soft sounds after the teacher. The tones felt awkward in her mouth, but she didn't care. Her accent was thick, her rhythm uneven, but she smiled anyway. Language was a bridge, and Lilian was building hers. After class, a girl beside her leaned over shyly. "Your accent is good," she whispered in slow English. Lilian laughed, her voice light. "It's terrible." But they both smiled, and it was the first time in weeks Lilian felt the warmth of something almost like friendship. The fashion school tour was like walking through a dream. Designers moved with practiced elegance, their fingers dancing over silk and thread. Lilian listened to every word, eyes alive with recognition. This world, fabrics, silhouettes, storytelling through cloth, this was where she belonged. When the professor asked a question about layering textures for a spring line, she didn't hesitate. "I would use raw silk," she said confidently, "layered with minimal stitching. Let the material speak for itself." The students blinked. The professor smiled. "You think like someone born into this industry." Lilian said nothing. She didn't need to explain who she used to be. Her work would speak for her now. The Gen Tech boardroom was a different battlefield. Yŭxuān walked in with her at his side, and the tension in the room thickened. "Why is she here?" someone whispered. "A publicity stunt?" murmured another. Lilian sat quietly, ignoring them all. She listened. The presentation began. Numbers, maps, projections for international expansion. Lilian leaned toward Yŭxuān, her voice low but firm. "Their overseas strategy will collapse," she said. "The supply chain isn't equipped for global distribution. They'll fail before the second quarter." He blinked, surprised. Then he nodded. "Say it," he told her. So she did. She stood, steady and sure, and broke down their strategy piece by piece. Her voice didn't waver. Her analysis was razor sharp. By the end, the room was silent. One board member chuckled nervously. "Looks like your wife came with teeth." Yŭxuān didn't smile, but he looked directly at Lilian. "I told you she was brilliant." The rooftop glowed gold in the fading light. Lilian leaned against the railing, watching the skyline stretch endlessly before her. The wind was sharper up here. She folded her arms against the chill. Footsteps approached behind her, steady and familiar. "I like it up here," she said softly, not turning around. "It reminds me I'm still alive." There was a pause. Then something warm settled over her shoulders. His jacket. "You should have told me you were cold," Yŭxuān murmured. She turned slowly, her eyes lifting to meet his. "You came all the way up here just for that?" "I come wherever you are," he said simply. Her breath caught for half a second. He wasn't teasing. It wasn't a line. It was the truth. Dinner was quiet that night, but different from before. When Lilian reached for her tea, Yŭxuān refilled it without a word. When she yawned, he casually signaled the staff to bring dessert early. When she excused herself from the table, he rose as well, out of instinct. The butler blinked in surprise. "She has changed you," he whispered as Yŭxuān followed her out. "No," Yŭxuān replied. "She's reminded me who I wanted to be." He hadn't always been this way. There had been a time, long ago, when Yŭxuān was just a boy in a dim apartment, watching his mother cough through the night. Thin blankets, thin walls, thin hope. His father's voice never came from a warm body. only a cold phone. Tell the boy to focus. I don't invest in failures. His mother turned to Yŭxuān with tired eyes and her cracked smile. You'll be better than him one day, she whispered. Not colder, better. She died that winter, and Yŭxuān never cried. Lilian laughed. It was soft, real, a little surprised. He turned his head toward her, startled by the sound. She was laughing over something he hadn't even meant to be funny. But the sight of her like that, flushed and free, startled him more than the silence ever had. She was alive in a way he hadn't seen before. Something shifted in his chest. Something tender. Something dangerous. She caught him staring. What? She asked, still breathless from laughter. He didn't look away. You're beautiful when you laugh, he said. A pause. Then Lilian blushed. Just a little. But she didn't look away either. They began to exist in quiet moments. She adjusted his tie before meetings, brushing her fingers down the silk with gentle precision. He waited outside her class with warm buns and fresh coffee, even when he pretended to be too busy. She fell asleep one evening in the library, her head resting on a pile of books. And when she woke, a scarf had been laid over her shoulders. They watched sunsets in silence, shoulder to shoulder, saying nothing. But they didn't need to. It wasn't grand, but it was gentle, and it was real. The cameras flashed furiously as Lilian stepped onto the red carpet at the International Gala. She wore a deep gold dress that shimmered under the lights, regal and radiant. At her side, Yŭxuān stood tall in a crisp black suit, his gaze never leaving her. They walked into the ballroom hand in hand. Miles away, in a high-rise suite back in the U.S., a figure stood before a massive screen. The live stream glowed across the wall. Cheryl. She didn't blink. Her painted lips curled slowly, bitterly. She was supposed to disappear, she hissed under her breath. Not rise. The glass in her hand cracked, and the darkness inside her deepened. It started with an accident. A folder slipped from one of the shelves in the study, an old one, tucked behind legal binders and outdated records. Lilian bent to pick it up, expecting dry numbers and business reports. But it wasn't that. It was personal. Her father's name filled the header of an old email chain, and beneath it was Yŭxuān's. She sank slowly into the leather chair by the window, flipping through the messages. Her father's words were careful but warm, thoughtful, curious. There were discussions of joint investments, market strategies, even fashion tech fusion ventures. He hadn't just worked with Yŭxuān. He had trusted him. Your instincts are rare. You remind me of myself when I was younger, one line read. Another, if anything happens to me, I want Lilian to stand beside someone who sees the world the way I do. Her hands trembled. She began digging. And once she started, she couldn't stop. Documents, spreadsheets, hidden directories under false names, shell companies, diversions of funds. There had never been a bankruptcy. There had never been debt. Cheryl had been bleeding the company dry for years, covering her tracks with forged reports and offshore transfers. She had set the stage perfectly, hidden just enough to frame the collapse, stolen just enough to disappear if questioned. Lilian stared at the papers in front of her, jaw tight, stomach roiling. Every word, every sacrifice, every decision she'd made to save her family. All of it had been built on lies. She didn't eat that day, didn't speak. She sat curled on the floor of the study, her head against the glass wall as the rain tapped lightly against it, like it had the night she left home. Yŭxuān found her there hours later. He said nothing at first. He simply knelt beside her and placed a blanket over her shoulders. I believed her, Lilian whispered. Her voice cracked like something breaking inside her. I gave up my life for her lies. She shook her head, tears slipping freely down her cheeks now. I lost everything. Yŭxuān's voice was quiet, steady, but heavy with something unspoken. Then take it back. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment, her grief flickered into something sharper. Determination. That night, she still couldn't sleep, but he stayed with her anyway. They didn't speak much. She sat in the corner of his office while he sifted through folders and coded messages. At some point, she moved closer, pulled her laptop beside his, and started tracing financial trails with him. Side by side, the two of them moved through the pieces of her father's empire, broken, corrupted, stolen, and began putting them back together. Days bled into nights. Emails were decoded. Names were traced. Shell accounts were cracked open like rotten fruit. Lilian barely noticed the hours anymore. She drank more coffee than she ever had in her life. Her hair was always pinned up. Her sleeves were always rolled. She worked like she was fighting for oxygen. Because she was. And Yŭxuān was always there, bringing her food when she forgot to eat, keeping documents in perfect order, watching her from the corner of his eye like she might disappear if he blinked too long. They began sharing ramen at the long table in the quiet hours of the night, sometimes too tired to speak, other times laughing softly about nothing at all. Once, she dropped sauce on her notebook and groaned. Yŭxuān simply slid his own toward her. "You're more organized anyway," he said. She smiled, and something soft bloomed in his chest. They didn't notice when things changed, when lingering glances became longer, when silence became comforting instead of awkward, when her hand brushed his on the keyboard and she didn't pull away, when he leaned in too close to help her read something and neither of them moved. One night she fell asleep beside him. It was late, too late, and her head slumped onto his shoulder mid-sentence. Her breath slowed, and her body went still. He looked down at her, startled. She was beautiful like this, software, peaceful, tired from trying to save the world her father left behind. Yŭxuān watched her for a moment longer before carefully sliding his arms beneath her knees and shoulders. She stirred faintly, but didn't wake. He carried her through the halls, past dim chandeliers and silent rooms, and gently laid her on her bed. He tucked the blanket up to her chin. As he turned to leave, her fingers brushed his sleeve. "Stay," she murmured, barely conscious. He paused, then he pulled the chair closer, sat beside her bed, and folded his arms quietly. He stayed. There were no cameras, no reporters, no onlookers, just them. A quiet temple nestled in the mist-covered hills outside Shanghai. The sun had just begun to rise, casting soft gold over stone pathways and blossoming plum trees. Lilian stood beneath a draping canopy of silken light, her white heinfu flowing like water. It shimmered with soft embroidery, the sleeves long and graceful, framing every breath she took. Around her neck and wrists were golden accents of her heritage, traditional African jewelry passed down from her mother. Symbols of legacy, of beauty, of strength. Yŭxuān stood across from her in pale robes of silver and deep jade, quiet and composed, but his eyes never left her. There was no officiant, no audience, only the wind between them, the vows they had written themselves, and the ancient hush of the mountain air holding them in sacred witness. Lilian's voice trembled as she reached for his hand. "I didn't come here expecting to find you," she said, "but you never looked away from me. Not when I cried, not when I failed, not when I didn't believe I could rise." Her fingers brushed his, and he clasped them slowly, reverently. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring," she whispered, but I want to walk into it with you. Yŭxuān's voice was low and sure. I wasn't born knowing how to love, he said, but you taught me. With every glance, every argument, every silence you let me sit in. You made me want to be warm again. The wind caught in her veil and the moment held. Then, he leaned in, gently cupping her face. Their first kiss was slow, deliberate, breathless. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't rehearsed. It didn't need to be. Lilian melted into him, tears slipping down her cheeks as her body finally surrendered to everything she'd been holding in. Loss, love, fear, hope. It all rushed forward like the breaking of a dam. Yŭxuān pulled back just enough to see her face, brushing the tears from her skin with his lips. You don't have to be strong with me, he murmured. You're allowed to break. She choked out a laugh that turned into a sob. And if I fall apart, she asked, then I'll be the one who holds you together. Later that evening, Lilian wandered through the quiet corridors of the temple house. The ceremony had ended, dinner had been shared, and Yŭxuān had left to take a call. The world was still. She stepped into one of the smaller studies, her fingers trailing along the edge of a bookshelf until they reached a small lacquered box. Something about it felt out of place. Inside were old memory drives, labeled in her father's handwriting. She hesitated, then reached for the one marked Lilian Anarmod, last call, confidential. Her breath hitched. She plugged it into the laptop on the desk. The audio file crackled to life. Yŭxuān, her father's voice said, weary but clear. If you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it. Lilian froze. I don't know who I can trust anymore, but I know you'll protect her. My wife, Cheryl, she's been moving money behind my back. She's planning something. I can't prove it yet, but if anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident. I need you to look after Lilian. She's not ready to lose everything. Then silence, and Lilian's world crumbled again. She collapsed, right there on the study floor. Her knees gave out, her hands scrambling to catch the laptop as it fell with a thud against the carpet. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The tears rushed faster than her lungs could keep up. Her father had known. He had tried to protect her. He had known. Appa, she sobbed. Appa, I didn't know. I didn't know. She didn't hear the footsteps, but she felt the arms that caught her. Yŭxuān swept her into his lap without hesitation, his voice already whispering to her, low and firm. I've got you. She shook her head violently. She lied to me again. I gave up everything. You didn't lose everything, he said, holding her tighter. You still have me. Lilian curled into him, fists clutching his robes like they were the only solid thing left in the world. I should have known, she cried. I should have seen it. No, he whispered. She doesn't deserve your love. You love someone who didn't deserve it. That's not weakness. That's who you are. Don't lose that. She couldn't speak, only cry, but he stayed. Through every broken sob, through every scream that never left her throat, through every minute of wordless grief. He held her until the stars came out, and long after. The private jet touched down just after dawn. The skyline of her home city blinked through the fog, familiar but distant, like the ghost of a life she once lived. Lilian stood at the top of the jet stairs, eyes narrowed, wind brushing the hem of her black coat. Her fingers curled tightly around the file in her hand. It wasn't just paper. It was proof, audio files, forged financials, shell companies, siphoned assets. The full truth, sliced clean like glass. She stepped down slowly. This wasn't the girl who left in tears. This was someone reborn. The elevator doors opened on the top floor of Anarmod Global, and silence rippled through the halls like an earthquake. Executives froze mid-conversation. Assistants blinked. Someone dropped their phone. Lilian walked straight through the corridor in a charcoal gray suit tailored to her frame, heels clicking in perfect rhythm. Her curls were pinned into an elegant crown. Her expression didn't flicker. At her side, 2 attorneys followed, silent, composed, lethal. The boardroom doors opened before she could even touch them. Inside, the board members sat in quiet confusion. At the head of the table sat Cheryl, dressed in her usual pristine white, lips glossed into a smile. She didn't rise. "Lilian," she said lightly, folding her hands. "How dramatic of you." Lilian didn't blink. She walked to the end of the table, placed her leather folder down, and opened it. Papers fanned across the glass surface like feathers. Then, with one slow motion, she hit play. Her father's voice filled the room. "If you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it." Gasps. Eyes widened. The air shifted. Lilian didn't look at anyone but Cheryl. "And if anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident." The boardroom erupted into chaos. Someone stood up. Another cursed under their breath. Cheryl's expression cracked for just a moment. Then she laughed. It was hollow, sharp. "Really, Lilian? You think this is enough? This is nothing but conjecture." Lilian turned her head slightly, calm, patient. And then the doors opened again. Yŭxuān stepped in, straight-backed, immaculate, icy. Behind him, 2 forensic accountants, a cybersecurity specialist, and a financial investigator filed in. "We brought witnesses," he said flatly. Cheryl's smile died. The security team arrived 20 minutes later. Cheryl's voice rose in pitch, flailing between threats and denials. "You little snake," she hissed, being handcuffed. "Everything I did for this family. I saved us. I built—" "You built nothing," Lilian interrupted softly. Cheryl lunged, but the guards held her back. "You wouldn't exist without me," she spat. Lilian stepped forward, eyes locked on her. "You tried to destroy me," she said, "but all you did was sharpen me." Cheryl's face twisted in rage, and just like that, she was escorted out. The boardroom emptied in a hush. Reporters would swarm, stories would spin, the world would react. But for now, Lilian didn't want any of it. She returned home quietly. No press, no ceremony. Just her and the sound of gravel beneath the tires as the car pulled into the old estate. She walked through the front doors of her childhood home, slowly, reverently, as if she were stepping into a sacred temple. The air still smelled like jasmine and dust. She climbed the stairs she once ran across as a little girl and opened the door to the bedroom that had once been her entire world. Nothing had changed. Not the books on the shelf, not the tiny crack in the corner of the window, not the watch on her desk. Her father's watch. She picked it up. It was still ticking. She sat down on the bed, clutching the timepiece in her palm, and closed her eyes. He was gone. But he had never left her. It started with a single name, Anarmod. Lilian stared at the gold-plated letters gleaming from the top of the corporate tower. Still intact, still proud, but it no longer felt like home. Not yet. She stood in the boardroom once again, but this time at the head of the table. The same seat her father once occupied. Only now, it belonged to her. But she wasn't here to preserve the past. She was here to build the future. And so, she began. The rebranding took months. The vision was clear in her heart, but translating it into something the world could touch and feel took everything she had. The new Anarmod Global wasn't just sleek and powerful. It pulsed with the rhythm of her roots. Bold color palettes inspired by African textiles. Website design infused with modern Chinese minimalism. Tech-integrated fabrics. Eco-conscious production. New headquarters in Lagos, Shanghai, and Nairobi. She created collections named after queens who had been erased from history. Wove Swahili and Igbo names into product lines. Partnered with startups in rural Chinese provinces and West African communities alike. For the first time in years, her father's company wasn't just surviving, it was transforming. And in the heart of it all, she created something sacred, the Lawrence K. Anarmod Foundation, a charity for fatherless girls, for daughters raised in silence, for children who were overlooked until they burned bright. The day it opened, she stood on the main stage, holding the microphone with both hands. 1,000 people watched, but her voice, when she spoke, was meant for one man. For every little girl who's been told she needs to be quiet. For every dream they said was too loud. And for the father who taught me that kindness is strength. This is for you. The crowd rose to their feet. She didn't cry until she was off stage, and even then, it was joy. She didn't tell Yŭxuān she was coming. She boarded a flight to Shanghai with a single carry-on, her hair in soft curls, no press, no entourage. The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse floor of Gentech's corporate headquarters. His assistant stood up from her desk in alarm. "Miss Anarmod, he's in a meeting." But then the glass door to the office opened, and he was there. Yŭxuān froze mid-sentence. And then, "Lilian," he breathed. His voice cracked. She smiled and held up a sleek black folder. "I built something for us." He crossed the office in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her like he wasn't sure she was real. His forehead rested against hers, eyes closed, breath warm. "I missed you," he whispered. "Every day." She brushed a thumb over his cheek. "I know. I missed you too." He looked at the folder, then back at her. "Then let's rule it together." The days that followed were a blur of gentle chaos. The mornings were filled with board meetings and press releases. The evenings, a different story. Yŭxuān tried to make her dinner once, burned the rice, underseasoned the fish, overboiled the soup. "I'm not terrible," he insisted, flipping through a recipe book upside down. "You're hopeless," she teased, laughing as she plucked a burned green onion from his sleeve. Another night, they stayed in the office too late. Again. She fell asleep curled against his side on the leather sofa, head resting on his chest. He didn't move, just kept typing with one hand and stroking her hair with the other. And every time she yawned, every time she smiled, every time she passed him a document or leaned over his shoulder, he kissed her forehead, softly, without explanation. Because he could, because she was his. One evening, as the Shanghai skyline glittered outside their apartment window, Lilian stood barefoot in the kitchen, wearing one of his oversized shirts. He walked in, fresh from a shower, towel still draped around his shoulders. She turned to face him, radiant even in the simplest things. "I still don't know how we got here," she whispered. He stepped close, cupped her face with both hands. "Because you didn't give up," he murmured, "and I didn't let you go." Their kiss was soft this time, familiar, home. And the empire they rebuilt? It stood not on stone or steel, but on love. The road wound through the mist-draped hills like a silver thread, the city far behind them now. Lilian leaned against the car window, her breath fogging the glass as trees gave way to stone walls and an old iron gate dusted in frost. Yŭxuān stepped out first. He opened her door before she could even reach for the handle, offering his gloved hand with the kind of quiet instinct that no longer surprised her. "Where are we?" she asked, stepping out into the cool winter air. He didn't answer at first, just led her through the gate and into a hidden path lined with worn, moss-covered stones. Then she saw it, a garden, tucked into the base of the hill like a secret whispered between the earth and sky. The trees were bare, but beautiful, their limbs twisted upward in graceful arcs, framing the overcast sky. Snow rested on the stone benches, untouched. A frozen koi pond reflected the muted light. All around her, silence bloomed, pure and still. Lilian's breath caught in her throat. "It's like something out of a dream," she whispered. Yŭxuān nodded. It was hers. He stepped toward a small bench beneath a curved willow tree, sat down. His eyes softened, not distant, but far away. "My mother used to come here in winter," he said quietly. "Everyone always waited for spring, but she said the garden was more honest this way. No pretenses, no bloom, just truth." Lilian sat beside him, gently. "She would have loved you," he said. The words weren't casual. They came out as something heavy and sacred, held inside for too long. Lilian turned to him slowly. "I think my father already loved you." They didn't speak for a while. The wind moved gently through the branches above them, as if nature itself were breathing slower to give them room. He reached for her hand, gloved fingers lacing with hers. There was no need for grand declarations, no hunger, no urgency, just stillness. And then he leaned in. Their kiss was quiet, no fire, no ache, just peace, like the garden. When they parted, their foreheads stayed pressed together. The space between them had vanished long ago. There was no need to chase each other anymore. They had already arrived. The lights above the stage were warm but soft, like early morning sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Rows upon rows of seats stretched out into the grand auditorium. Diplomats, scholars, entrepreneurs, dreamers, women of every background, every age, every skin tone. The kind of audience her younger self would have never believed she'd stand before. Lilian took one step forward, then another. The applause slowly faded. Silence wrapped around her, not cold, but reverent. She stood beneath a backdrop that read, International Women's Leadership Forum. Her name was etched below it, bold and golden. Keynote speaker, Lilian Anarmod. She placed her palms gently on either side of the podium. Then she looked out and spoke. "I used to think survival was the goal," she began, her voice steady. "That if I could just make it through the next day, the next betrayal, the next loss, I would be okay." She paused. I was wrong. Eyes across the room stayed locked on her. "I didn't survive to hide. I didn't survive to shrink. I survived to stand, to speak, to build." She smiled softly, not rehearsed, not polite, real. "We are not the ashes left behind by tragedy," she said, voice rising. "We are the fire that shapes the future." A heartbeat of silence. Then applause thundered across the room. Some people stood. Others wiped tears from their cheeks. She stepped back from the podium, heart pounding, not from fear, but from something like joy. And as she descended the steps, there he was. Yŭxuān stood near the base of the stage, dressed in sleek black, hands tucked into his coat pockets. But his eyes were full of so much love it almost undid her. He said nothing at first, but his smile reached her before his words did. "You burned the house down," he said softly, "and planted a kingdom in the ashes." She reached for him without hesitation, threading her fingers through his. "You were there through the fire," she whispered. I'll be there through everything else, he replied. They walked side by side down the marble hall, past pillars and portraits, reporters and aides, the world beginning to tilt back into motion. But to them, it moved slower, softer. With each step, their hands remained entwined, not tight, not desperate, just right. Like they had always been meant to walk this way, not behind one another, not ahead, but together. The world behind them, the future before them, and love in every